Oh, hey there. Welcome to my new YouTube channel. My main channel at Wesley Cyber is where I talk about various cyber things. I do lots of work with Palo Alto Networks. I show how to solve particular problems with the Palo Alto Networks products, especially the firewall. And I'm also talking a lot in there about the new certifications. But I wanted to make a new channel where I just have thoughts about things not related to cyber necessarily. One thing that I'll probably talk a lot about is the military. As you can see here, I'm a proud member of the U.S. Air Force, specifically the Air National Guard. I was active duty U.S. Air Force for 4 years, and I've been in the Air National Guard for also almost 4 years now. So that makes about a total of 8 years. And for my first video, I mostly just wanted to tell you guys, what is the National Guard?
National Guard units.
Incredible men and women of our National Guard, very special people.
Of course, I said I'm a member of the Air National Guard, but as a Guardsman, that is part of the overall National Guard. So I want to talk about what is the National Guard. The main reason I wanted to talk about this is because right now I'm on military orders with the National Guard. So I thought this video might be helpful for my coworkers, especially, and potentially my customers who are wondering what I'm doing, why I go on these orders, what I'm spending my time doing while I'm not working with them. So I thought I would just give you a general idea of what the National Guard is and why I do it. So let me just talk a little bit about the reserve component. So when you think of reserves, it's not reserves like reserved parking. It's more reserves like maybe you have some food reserves in your garage. Some people keep canned food in their garage or extra food in their refrigerator. It's basically an additional source that you can tap from when needed. And the military reserves is the same way. So the Air Force has an Air Force Reserve, and that is just directly part of the Air Force. So they belong to the U.S. Air Force, and those people are part-time. They go through all the regular training of the Air Force, and if the Air Force needs them for a specific mission, or if war breaks out, then they have an additional force that they can tap into that's been trained and is ready to execute on Air Force missions. It's basically what the Air Force Reserve is. Of course, they also usually have regular activities that they'll do, but they're more in a part-time capacity. If you're in the Air Force Reserve, usually you'll have a full-time job and you're doing the Air Force Reserve in addition to that. The National Guard is also part of the reserve component, except it's a little bit different. The National Guard is different mostly because we also belong to a state. Now, if you know, if you follow me on LinkedIn or you've seen any of my materials, you know that I live in Jacksonville, Florida, but I do not live in the state where I serve in the National Guard, actually. I am in the California National Guard, and that's because I used to live in California. When I was active duty Air Force, I lived in, the Air Force sent me to Los Angeles, so I joined a nearby National Guard unit in northern Los Angeles. So I joined the California Air National Guard, which is part of the California National Guard. Therefore, I belong both to the Air Force, but I also belong to the state of California. And in that capacity, my chain of command runs up to the governor of California. When I support the state, I am assigned to the governor of California. I have orders that say, by order of the governor of California. And below that governor is what we call the adjutant general. We use TAG for short. I don't know why the T in TAG is part of the acronym, like the adjutant general, a little bit weird. I think it's because AG was already taken. That's attorney general. So it's just easier to call that person the TAG. And in California, we have Major General Matthew Beavers. He's the TAG, and he's the commander of the California National Guard. So he's in charge of the whole National Guard. We also have Major General Stephen Buetow, who's in charge of the California Air National Guard, and he reports to Major General Beavers, who then reports to the governor, like I mentioned before. So I'm also part of the state of California. What this means is that I can do Air Force missions, but I also am required to support the state, especially in times of emergency.
And when our country is hit by fire, flood, or vicious storm, America turns to the National Guard because we know we can always count on you. We always can count on you.
Many of you may have seen all the news recently about the fires in Los Angeles, and the National Guard was a big part of that. The National Guard is often supporting various emergencies around the United States, not just in California, but also in the Southeast here, where we have a lot of hurricanes. Usually after hurricanes happen, National Guard will get activated to support those emergencies, to help recover from those emergencies. What's great about that is as National Guardsmen, we receive a lot of training from the federal government, like I mentioned. So we get to use that training for our state missions. In the Army, a lot of the training that people might learn, such as maneuver, coordinating, controlling crowds in large populated areas that people may have learned for anti-terrorism operations overseas. The same types of skills can be applied for domestic emergency response operations. Obviously, they're not the same. I don't want to indicate that they're the same, but a lot of those skills do transfer over. So it makes sense if those people are already trained in those things to take advantage of some of that training here domestically so that people can help when there's emergencies and they're given the authorities to do that. In my field, cyber, it's actually a lot easier. It's actually there's very clear alignment with not only my military job and my state role, but also with my private sector job where I work for the largest cybersecurity company, at least, manufacturer in terms of dollars, Palo Alto Networks. So I really work in cybersecurity in all three areas, and I'm able to provide cybersecurity to the Air Force when the Air Force needs me, and cybersecurity to the state when the state needs me. And of course, I work a lot in cybersecurity in my regular job as well, my full-time job at Palo Alto Networks. But as part of this, like I mentioned, we have to do a lot of training. We're expected to be always ready. Actually, the motto of the National Guard is always ready, always there.
You are always ready and always there.
We're expected to be always ready, and so we do a lot of training. For some people, it can be a little bit weird because sometimes it feels like we're just training nonstop. But that is because we're part of the reserve component. We're expected to be ready, which requires training and being ready, and we're only called upon when we're really needed. The active duty members and the full-time employees of the state will execute those functions that are needed day to day, and we're only needed for what we call surge operations. So when I need additional people, I'm going to surge my manpower, I'm going to bring in additional people, and some of those people will be people like me that are needed. But most of the time, I'm just doing training and preparation. I also do exercises in addition to just standard training you might be used to. We do exercises, which is still a form of training. At least I would argue is still a form of training, but it's basically practicing what exactly you're going to do. So exercises are very common. As some people know, I am on the planning team for an exercise we have in California called Cyber Dawn, where we're preparing for a large-scale cyber incident that could happen, hypothetically. If it did happen, we want to be prepared for it. So we exercise it. We practice what would we do in the case that a large-scale cyber incident happened in FEMA Region 9, which is basically the western states, California, Nevada, Arizona, Hawaii, and some of the territories in the Pacific. But that's an example of exercises that are run. Obviously, on the non-cyber side, there are lots of exercises as well where they're practicing for other types of activities. But hopefully that kind of explains what I mean by an exercise versus standard training. So that's the difference between the National Guard and the reserves, is we have those state functions with emergency response. And there is some bureaucracy associated with that. Whenever I do go work for the Air Force full time, I actually have to be released by my state. So the state has to agree to release me. Now, you might be wondering, what happens if the state and federal governments don't agree? What if there's some kind of conflicting priority? And this actually has happened more than a few times. One time, some people may or may not be aware of this, but in Alabama, there was a governor in the 60s who did not want to allow students of color to enter the university. And so he stood out front of the university, even though there had already been a federal mandate requiring him to allow those students in the university. He stood outside the university with police officers and was blocking these new students of color from entering the university. And at the time, JFK actually federalized the National Guard within Alabama using something called the Insurrection Act. So the Insurrection Act actually allows the president to federalize the National Guard if he or she feels that the state is going against federal law. And so in that particular case, JFK was able to federalize the National Guard of Alabama, and the adjutant general, the TAG, went up to the governor and told him to move aside in order to allow the students to enter the school. That ended peacefully, and that was one of the first major steps of integration in the United States, ending of segregation. Another example, much more recent, is something called Operation Lone Star. This was done by, or is I believe Operation Lone Star is still occurring, but this is Greg Abbott, the current governor of Texas, began Operation Lone Star, in which he is using his National Guard troops in Texas as border security. So he is adding to the Customs and Border Patrol mission by sending troops of the National Guard to the border. And in the previous administration under Joe Biden, this caused a lot of conflict between the federal government and the state government. And the government of Texas did send people there, and there were some small altercations between the Department of Homeland Security and the National Guard members from Texas, in which there was some question over who really owns this mission and should Texas be doing that. Joe Biden did not use the Insurrection Act to tell Greg Abbott to stop sending the National Guard there, but it was another example in which the two sides did not agree, because Joe Biden was at least seemingly not supportive of Greg Abbott's use of the National Guard for additional border security at the Texas border with Mexico. So those are just some examples of how the National Guard can kind of be caught in the middle between the state and the federal government. In the first example, obviously the federal government used its powers to win out, and those members were forced to be federalized and work for the federal government. In the other example, they continued to follow the orders of the state, and then obviously now we have a new administration, so we'll see how Operation Lone Star plays out going forward. But those are just some examples. Now, some people might wonder about what it's like to be gone. Like, what does it mean? You're just leaving your job and then you're coming back? And yes, I do have to leave my job sometimes. And obviously, there's the training courses, which are usually only a couple weeks long, a few weeks long. Most jobs can handle that. But there are times in which, as a National Guardsman, we can deploy. We can deploy within the state if there's some sort of major operation. I mean, the fires have been going on for a long time. If there's some need that someone needs to activate within the state for several weeks or months, or obviously with the military side, if we need to go overseas to the Middle East in the past, or to Europe, or wherever, then you may be gone for a much longer period of time as a National Guardsman. So how does all that work? Well, employers are required to allow National Guardsmen, their employees who are National Guardsmen, to attend these events. They're required by something called the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Uniform Services Employment and Reemployment Relief Act, I think, USERRA. I think I'm missing one letter there, but I believe it's relief, to hold the position of that person for up to 5 years. So my employer, if I was to deploy for 4.5 years, they would technically have to hold my position. They couldn't fire me. They don't have to pay me during that time, of course, but they have to hold my position. There's, of course, certain exceptions if they go out of business or whatever. There's obviously exceptions. And in USERRA, that law, it talks about the public burden. So that basically these employers are doing this and they're accepting some level of a public burden for their protection. So they're saying that, because people like me and all the wonderful people in my squadron are agreeing to give up some of our time and our energy to help protect our country and our state, that these companies it's going to be painful for them. I can tell you, I'm sure my employer, if my boss is watching this, I'm sure she will tell you that it can be painful for our team at times when I leave. But that company is accepting that public burden, and the U.S. voter and taxpayer has agreed to allow to require these companies to accept that burden on behalf of the American people to receive the benefits of having this additional reserve force within the National Guard.
The National Guard is America's first and last line of defense.
So that's how that works. So USERRA is basically the protection mechanism for National Guardsmen and reservists to continue to be able to serve and not be punished by our companies for the time that we have to take away. The last thing I wanted to say is the National Guard has been very challenging. I will admit that sometimes it's maybe always a lot of work for me to maintain staying in the National Guard and to also have my regular job. I have family responsibilities as well. I have a lot of things going on, and so the National Guard on top of that has been very, very demanding and been a lot of work. But I cannot be prouder to be a National Guardsman, not because of some kind of calling or anything like that, but really because of the people that I've met in the National Guard. I've just met some of the most impressive people that I can imagine, both in my cyber unit, but also in other units in non-cyber fields. In my cyber unit in particular, just some really, really amazing people who have very amazing, successful careers outside of the National Guard and are really basically volunteering their time just because they really care so much about the mission, and we really do build a sense of unity and camaraderie within the unit. So I just wanted to say, just close this video by saying thank you to everyone who is serving in the National Guard. You all just make me really proud to be a member of the National Guard and all really proud to be an American. Hey, thanks for watching my video.